Good afternoon. Welcome to this meeting which commemorates the Bandung Day, something which was a landmark event in global history in 1955, when there was a surge of commitment to Afro-Asian solidarity. And later on, we saw that hallowed commitment which came up in the post-colonial movement was followed by overt and covert opposition from Western nations. But currently there is even a greater need to revisit why Bandung took place and how relevant it is to contemporary global history. To address this, we have a galaxy of eminent speakers with a vast amount of experience from global diplomacy, public policy, historical analysis, and political expertise. So, without much ado, I'd like to welcome you all and then hand over to the director of the Council for Social Development, Shri K.N. Srivastavaji, for his initial welcoming remarks.
Dr. Srinath Reddy, President CST, and Mr. Shamsaran, President India Center, Professor Manoranjan Mahanti, Professor Amabaru, Ambassador Veera Shankar, other dignitaries present here, ladies and gentlemen. A very good afternoon to all of you. I welcome you all to this symposium, which is going to be held on the occasion of Bandung Day, which we are celebrating today. The symposium is titled Bandung to BRICS, Women, War and Peace. On this occasion, let us briefly recall the 10 binding principles, which basically ranged from respect for fundamental human rights to respect for sovereignty and integral territory of all nations, to the settlement of all international disputes by peaceful means, and respect for justice and international obligations. They are more relevant than ever before. Basically, in that conference, which was held in 1955, 4 important goals were identified, and they were: end of colonialism, protection of sovereignty of all nations, to avoid domination by great powers, and the 4th one was to promote cooperation between developing countries. From these, the binding spirit emerged, and so also later the non-aligned movement itself. Bandung Day continues to remain relevant. What was the situation prevailing when this Bandung conference was held and those resolutions were passed? And what are those situations prevailing in the present days? Briefly, I just draw your kind attention. At that time in 1955, the world was bipolar. One bloc was led by USA, the other by USSR. And smaller countries were having the risk of becoming satellites of one of these two. But Bandung, the Bandung conference offered a third path, that is political independence without joining any power bloc. Now the situation is that there is a competition going on between US and China. There is a tension prevailing relating to Ukraine crisis between Russia and Western nations. Many countries now practice multi-alignment, and there are certain things which are indicating towards that. In this connection, I'd like to mention about ASEAN diplomacy, the Global South Cooperation. Bandung created the idea that developing countries are collective political actors. Today, this appears in BRIC expansion, South-South cooperation, climate justice demand, and reform of global institutions. The Bandung basic idea was that sovereign equality should be, available to all. There should be no interference, and all interested disputes should be settled through peaceful means. Anti-colonial and anti-racist principles should be completely discarded. So these ideas which emanated then will always remain very relevant. Now I come to the symposium which is going to be held today. The theme, as we know, is that respecting sovereignty, equality, peace, and human rights. This is very much in harmony with the Bandung principles of 1955. And I understand that during this symposium, the panelists will address from the vantage point of women issues that have led to recent wars and how to build conditions for peace in contemporary times. This is a timely and deeply significant initiative, as all too often in a war zone, it is non-combatants such as women and children who face the worst consequences and unfortunately suffer collateral damage. The Bandung Conference, which was held from 1844 to 1955, in which 29 Asian and African nations had taken part, posed a new path for post-colonial world. The resulting 10 Bandung principles are what they called it as the Sisila Bandung, articulated a vision of peace, solidarity, and self-determination, and served as a foundation for the non-aligned movement. By embracing peaceful coexistence and opposing colonialism, Bandung gave indeed a very powerful voice to the global south. India is preparing to host the 18th BRICS Summit in September this year, a major event in the global diplomatic calendar that will highlight India's role in building consensus among members amidst shifting global dynamics. While moving ahead with new initiatives, we should remember the Bandung spirit. It continues to represent South-South cooperation, solidarity, and democratization of international relations. It reminds us to prioritize dialogue over aggression and cooperation over domination. Let us uphold these values in our pursuit for justice, equitable, peaceful in multipolar world. With these remarks, I would conclude, hoping that the discussions here will be fruitful, productive, and that the outcome of the symposium will offer valuable inputs for policy decisions and going forward. Before I end, I would also like to particularly congratulate Professor Mondrajan Mahanti. Thank him, because he is the one who has been helping all of us year after year to celebrate this day with a lot of sovereignty, dedication, and affection towards each other. Thank you very much, and once again, a hearty welcome to each other. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Professor Mohanty and Professor Ramabaru have been steering the symposium, and they will now provide their insights into why the symposium is addressing a specific theme in the overall context of Bandung. Professor Mohanty, please. Professor Ramabaru.
Good afternoon. This is another persuasion of Professor Monti. We had a brief conversation and he said, what do you think the theme should be? So he had two ideas. One was, he said, on the whole issue of non-alignment, and the other was this question of war. And so I said, we really need to focus on the question of war and the role of women in war and peace. So thank you, Professor Monti, and I just want to make a few brief remarks. One, I think today's symposium marks an important juncture in the history of the world we live in, which is witness to many conflicts. There are conflicts within countries, there are conflicts across borders, which of course we are very well aware of. The other context is the assertion of US imperialism, creating a world without rules and laws, and also the partnering with other countries that also are perpetuating violence in the most abhorrent way. I also feel that the genocide in Gaza, the bombing of schools in Iran, and many others which we may not even know of, are also very, very important signals of this lawless world that we live in. It produces tremendous disruption and displacement of families, women, children, elderly, disabled. I mean, many of the vulnerabilities are born, and the shocks of these wars are born at a very, very deep familial level, at the level of women and children. The agenda of BRICS was a hopeful agenda for nations that were rising economies. It was also seen as a bulwark against the global north. Today, in the midst of war, I think the important thing is to evoke the legacy of the Bandung spirit that foregrounded, in my view, three very important principles: development, peace, and social justice. And I think the role of women in rebuilding their lives and societies is very, very critical. And therefore, this particular symposium is an important landmark in bringing that issue forward. With these few words, I hand over to Professor Monica.
Thank you, Rama. Thank you, Professor Sanath Reddy, Ambassador Samsaran. I wrote it even before confirming that you will be here. When we planned it together, all of us, particularly Ambassador Samsaran, he said he was uncertain. I said, but if you happen to be here, please join. So we are most grateful. Thank you, Professor Sanath Reddy, Ambassador Samsaran, Mr. K. Srivastav, and all of you, the speakers. These are speakers with whom each one of you would like to spend a whole day at least discussing. And we are most grateful to all of you. Co-organizers of CSD, IIC, great colleagues in both institutions, and colleagues, both teachers and students of DU colleges, especially Samlal and Sai Bhagat Singh College. We really appreciate your participation. JNU colleagues, Jamia colleagues, AUD, and other institutions. Thank you all for keeping the Bandung spirit alive. We thank Davis Kudori, the initiator and coordinator of the Bandung Spirit Network, for his message of solidarity. It is in your file and it will be circulated. We are most grateful to him. We also remember Kapila Bachchan-ji, Muskun Dubey-ji, and Anita Kaur, CSD director in 2016 when we started this, for launching this annual program enthusiastically. This shows that decolonization, fighting domination and creating people's alternatives in all spheres continues to be a challenge locally, nationally, and globally. In addressing the Asian Relations Conference, 23rd March to 2nd April 1947, I hope the ICWA will remember and will observe the 80th anniversary next year. Next year is very important. Also, the centenary of the Brussels Anti-Imperialist Conference. Mahatma Gandhi, addressing the Asian Relations Conference, pointed out that and we have several of his quotes in the exhibition in the CSD seminar hall, which is open till 6 o'clock today. He said, the essence of the wisdom of common people of Eastern civilization is peace, love, and truth. And the conference president, Sarojini Naidu, gave a staggering call, I quote, to abolish once and for all differences between man and man, class and class, creed and creed, culture and culture. The Asian Relations Conference's message of peace, freedom, and equality. Nehru, who steered the whole conference, emphasized, the dimensions of liberation. So peace, freedom, and equality, the message of ARC, set the Bandung decolonization agenda in the Dasasila that Mr. Srivastava has already referred to in 1955. Admittedly, gender and the environment were not at the core. That is where BRICS declaration since 2006 has declarations have widened the agenda of democratic restructuring of the global political economy, taking up issues ranging from trade and finance, currency and so on, to education, health, communication, so many such things. In all this, gender, environment, and technology, now AI, etc., are at the core. To what extent BRICS carries forward the Bandung agenda is a question to explore. At the present moment of wars, together with global economic crisis and serious environment and climate crisis, women at the vantage point leads us in a challenging direction. Firstly, it draws attention to the worst victims of war, as the Israeli genocide in Gaza has shown. Secondly, there are dimensions of the war process before, during, and after, and their effects, especially social, economic, environmental, cultural, etc., which are often missed otherwise. Women vantage point has this focus. Thirdly, in this way, we clearly recognize the agency role that women have played in history, in the various roles during the war, in peacemaking and conflict resolution, in post-conflict rebuilding, and many other areas. And I will not go on. Let us open what promises to be an exciting discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Bhanti. I may now request Professor Anuradha Mitra Chanwai to open the discussion and lead us on a much more elaborate examination of the topics that have already been listed.
Dr. Reddy, friends, colleagues, and students, I'm very honored to be here. And what I'm going to argue and show are really the links between Bandung, the NAM movement, the BRICS, and the Women, Peace and Security agenda. My first argument is that whether it's Bandung, NAM, and the BRICS, their commonality is that these are broadly counter-hegemonic and autonomous spaces. But within them, there are actors who could be on both sides of the women war and peace question, which I will show how. Of course, Mr. Srivastava showed the context of Bandung, but if you see it from a teleological feminist view, that period could be characterized as one of a militarized, masculinist, patriarchal hegemony, where the third world states, the newly emergent states, as well as women, were both pressured to exchange their autonomy for protection. Further, there were three alternate spaces which were also birthed at this period. One, of course, was the rise of the Afro-Asian solidarity movement as signified by Bandung. Second was a human rights consciousness, with especially the debates within the first and third committee of the UN Commission on Human Rights. And third, away from the limelight, was the Asian women's movement and its own emancipatory project. And
all these three movements, it would be a mistake to homogenize them. So my central argument is that the moral, norm-based and framework of the Bandung principles, they got carried into the non-aligned movement, have influenced the BRICS, and they share trajectories and experiences and conceptualizations with the Asian women's movement. Of course, a core demand from Bandung, besides national sovereignty, was human equality, evident in the fact that it was the Afro-Asian countries who were the strongest supporters of the international human rights movement in the 1950s, as stated by the then UN Human Rights Commissioner, who said that the support for this came from the third world, whereas countries from Europe, England, France, Belgium, they all argued, and I have a quote from them saying that human rights were for advanced, civilized people, not those in the African and Asian ex-colonies. This is a direct quote from that meeting. But more than that, what I'm talking about is the Afro-Asian women's internationalism, which was never in the limelight when we talk of either Bandung or NAM or BRICS. We generally talk about the absences of women, but there were women's movements then. And this is revealed, and the evidence I give is of 3 conferences held in Asia. One in Beijing, 1949, before Bandung. So the solidarity and the vision of women came out in that conference. Many of its papers are missing, but there are still documents there. Then the second one was a 1958 Conference of Women in Colombo, earlier Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. And the 1961 Afro-Asian Solidarity Organization in Cairo, Egypt. Now, the commonality in all these 3 conferences was, one, the solidarity with the Afro-Asian anti-colonial movement. Second, interestingly, was that at their core, there was beginning a confrontation, confronting feminist imperialism. That is, Western imperialism was challenged first within these Asian conferences as being that the women's movement, of course, there were common emancipatory demands, but there were also very wide differences. And third was creating new terms of feminist solidarity, which reveals that the women's movement, one, was never undifferentiated, even within the third world. And second, the imbalances of power were reflected between women across the world. And that Western feminism was not the single source of women's emancipatory project, which is often portrayed in narratives. To continue now just into contemporary period, on the whole issue of women, war and peace, I take two quick case studies of Gaza, and of course, the war in Iran, which all of us, both the events, wars, the miseries of which we've been watching live streamed on our various social media. The Western states, there's a different view, but as far as the war is concerned, and I think I agree with what Rama and what Professor Mohanty said about the genocide in Gaza and how women were victims, but I'm not going to speak on that. What I'm going to speak on is that in this war in Iran, how I see it is that on the one side, there are these actions of the major hegemon and their partner, their ally in this, Israel, which show a pattern of genocide, excessive force, war crimes, unaccountability, violation of international law, bypassing international institutions, conventions, norms, a use of a very powerful narrative, sanctions, threats, including of apocalypse. But also, if you see the militate in these debates, whether Hegseth or Trump, there's a very sexualized expletives. There is uninhibited masculinity, and there is an opposition to see peace as weak, even if the Pope says it. So a rejection of peace and a masculinization of this hegemonic discourse. And on the other side is Iran, which is resisting empire with all its asymmetries, even though it's internally militarized. We can discuss that at some other point. But in this war, it is defending its equality as an independent state in the international system through resistance, leveraging whatever it has for survival. It showed its loyalty to Lebanon and the axis of resistance. And the rhetoric in the Iranian press, and I read Tehran Times to anecdote it, this rhetoric is full of concepts like autonomy, empowerment, equality, resistance. So this is the ontology of also the feminist movement. Now, I'm not saying that the Iran war is a feminist war at all by any means, but what I'm saying is there are contexts in which there is a rhetoric and that moral universe is expressed. Of course, there are always, there can always be huge ruptures between the moral universe and rhetoric and the reality, but nonetheless, it's very different and it is there. So, and at the same time, critical feminists are also in solidarity with the women's struggles within Iran. And we hope after the war that there would be a new social contract. So ultimately, to conclude, I have just 3 points of conclusion. One, that the NAM, BRICS, and Women, War and Peace agenda is not homogeneous, but polysemantic, as they have different and even contradictory trends. But the larger view is that they all oppose hegemony in their own way. Second, that the feminists within the war and peace discourse are divided, with some who take advantage of their positions, and they take positions which harm other women and children, who are spokespersons, let's say, for Trump, or who are, who have negotiated, they have leverage power for their own positions, but they do harm other women. And on the other side are those critical feminists who support peace, oppose militarization, stand against a system based on war, extraction, and exploitation. So ultimately then, and this is my last sentence, what is common in the women, peace, and security agenda with Bandungs and BRICS is the freedom of choice, autonomy, equality, empowerment without dominance. And for this solidarity, I think we require this kind of a united front with the Bandung principles, with the NAM movement, with BRICS and this WPS agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let me now move on to the next speaker, Ambassador Meera Shankar, please.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Anuradha, for putting this subject, which is a bit of a stretch, into a framework which makes it comprehensible and reasonably plausible. At Bandung, there were no women's voices, and there was no mention of gender equality, as was the case with regard to the Asian Relations Conference, where gender and environment did not figure on the agenda at all. But yes, these were wide, solidarity movements, bringing together countries which had been involved in the anti-colonial struggle. Some were still under apartheid, for instance, South Africa, but others were gaining independence or freedom movements were active. And in those heady days, I think the countries concerned actually thought that they could build a new world based on solidarity of developing countries. The principles that they espoused were based on their own experience with colonialism, so very strong emphasis on autonomy of decision making, on not joining any bloc or being pressurized by the great powers, so resistance to great power domination, equality of all nations, whether big or small, and racial equality, because their experience of colonialism had been one of race, and of course, respect for human rights and building economic cooperation. Non-interference in the internal affairs of states, non-aggression or threat or use of force against other countries, and peaceful settlement of disputes. So if you look at these principles, actually, these are the principles which should be the framework for building a stable, peaceful global order. But what do we see today? We see that actually the world is far more uncertain, more volatile, and more without any framework of laws or principles to guide the actions of major players in the global system. The principles of the UN Charter, other institutional agreements have been weakened or broken when it has suited the convenience of either great power in pursuit of unilateral economic, political, or military advantage in any particular field. Respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity are principles which have been abandoned by the great powers in the circumstances where they are pursuing their unilateral advantage. Global trade, which had been based on a rules-based order, first under GATT and then under the WTO, has again been completely, what could I say, have been changed from rules into a pick and choose. So you have the US, where there is now increasing protectionist sentiment against globalization because they are seen as not having been the outright victors of globalization, and that this has led to job losses and downward pressure on wages on their working class. So a rise in protectionist and nationalist sentiment. The US has imposed unilateral tariffs, breaking the MFN principle of the WTO, which was the foundational principle of all trade agreements. In the field of environment and climate change, the US has walked out of the Paris Agreement, so that is a setback, and it has walked out of all various institutions and understandings, about more than 60, I think 65 or so, which related to climate change. So that's a setback for global efforts to deal with this challenge. I think the plus point is advances in technology. And here you're seeing breakthroughs in renewable energy equipment and generation technologies, both in terms of making them more efficient and in terms of pricing, where now renewable energy technology with storage, which would give you 24-hour supply, is cheaper in India at least than the tariff for a new thermal power plant. So that's the plus side, that technological advances are shifting the needle in favor of more sustainable policies, but you're seeing a fight back, and you're seeing countries like the US again espouse the fossil fuel economy, basically seeing it as something which gives them advantage, and the world can deal with issues such as climate change, which they consider a hoax, on their own. Now, in this situation where you are seeing the contestation between the great powers erupt into actual conflict in Europe and in West Asia and in other parts of the world, there are ongoing conflicts which also have, connections to global players or regional players, allied to global players. you actually have a situation where you really need to emphasize once again the Bandung principles and involve women more in terms of building peace and security. So, on the one hand, you have an international system which is undergoing such a huge amount of flux that there is not much stability or certainty about either institutions or geopolitics or geoeconomics. And on the other hand, you have women who are now participating more in decision making, but certainly not far enough. So if you look at, what are the current statistics? You have only 28 countries which were led by a woman head of state in 2026. 101 have never had a woman leader. Similarly, with regard to participation in parliaments, it's now globally an average of 27%. India lags far behind with 14 to 15% participation in the Lok Sabha and 17% perhaps in the Rajya Sabha, and in the state assemblies only 9%. What can we do as women to actually empower women to play larger roles, not just in terms of actual machineries of government, but also at the grassroots level, because women can play different roles, both in terms of actual decision making, if we increase their empowerment and their participation in governance at all levels, not just at the topmost level, because then it's like an artificial kind of top-down. To what can we do to, improve grassroots organizations of women? Because women's movements have played an important role at the grassroots level, and there are examples. For instance, in Colombia in 2016. The women were an equal part on the delegations for peace negotiations between the government and FARC. Similarly, at the grassroots level, it was women's movements in Liberia which actually forced the warring factions to come to the table and negotiate peace. Similarly, you had other groups of women's organizations who have been active in conflict prevention at the local level or in peace building post conflict. So, what can be done to increase that voice? Because women, by and large, look at issues which impact the lives of their families and their day-to-day environment. They don't look so much at power. They don't look so much at strategic competition and, where you stand on the chessboard. They are able to collaborate better, and they have more patience in terms of actually mediating or being able to reconcile different factions and different voices. So I would hope that a conference like this not only actually helps us to recall the spirit of Bandung and what it stood for, but also to re-energize the principles which it espoused, which hold the promise of a world which is more equal, more stable, more just, and more peaceful. So I do hope that we get some positive suggestions out of this discussion. Thank you for organizing it.
Those who are online, please mute your phones or speakers. Thank you.
I'm supposed to go on next, but I've got a special request. Can I come last? I've only got some episodic thoughts. And if I could come last, I could, especially after We thought that would help us as far as I'm concerned. Please.
Sure, certainly. So now, I mean, all agendas are meant to be discarded. We shall, and that's not a statement from Trump. I should, now, I therefore call upon Ms. Rita Mitchell.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Reddy. Friends, I think it's rather appropriate that we are focusing on the Bandung moment, the Bandung spirit, and also constructing this arc of Bandung bricks, because in a sense, as many of the speakers before me have said, Bandung moment represented a convening of 29 liberated or liberating, in the process of being liberated, colonies. It was a moment when there was a coming together of a group that was trying to feel its way in the international system, claiming the legitimacy of a voice, claiming different values and principles, anti-imperialism, equality, justice, human rights, all that has been mentioned before, as well as now that you look at BRICS. Now, if Bandung was a moment of decolonial multilateralism, BRICS represents multipolarity, multilateralism. The problems with BRICS, well, I think we will just park them on the side. But there are two things that I want to pull out, both from Bandung as well as from BRICS, before I leave them aside. One is, interestingly, the role of China. Bandung represented the entry of China into the international, or the embrace of China into the international system. And this was a time when President Eisenhower had threatened to nuke China if it would militarily take over Formosa, that is Taiwan. It was a time when, in fact, there was a lot of uncertainty, very much the sense of an unsettled world, despite the fact that the international order was being put in place, the post-war international order, very much this sense of, in fact, nuclear war. After all, the Cold War was what? An ideological conflict between two nuclear powers who were very easy in their rhetoric of wanting to nuke not only each other, but others as well. China defied that kind of rhetoric by, in fact, as you know, in Bandung, it was the charmer. It was, in fact, not only it presented or Zhou Enlai projected himself as very much a person who was a diplomat, wanted to engage in diplomacy and talks rather than military aggression, wanted to, in fact, be a reconciler. Jump to today. Today, in fact, what is the kind of role that China, which has been projected all along as the great disruptor, what is the role it's playing today? It is, in fact, being critical of the law of the jungle that is being promoted these days. It is playing, in fact, the peacemaker. And I see, in fact, a connection between, as I said, the role that China played in Bandung and the role that today China, not necessarily as a member of BRICS, but BRICS is an interesting framework because, after all, who is he dealing with? He's dealing with two other members of BRICS. Saudi Arabia hasn't formally joined, but it is very much seen as a partner, and it has been invited. UAE is very definitely a partner, so that there are, and Iran, of course, so that there are a lot of combinations at play. But let me just move away from that to emphasize this was also both Bandung as well as today are very much centered on, in fact, the uncertainty over the nuclear question, not only in terms of Iran and nuclear weapons, but also the looseness with which we
talk of nuclear weapons and the use of nuclear weapons. After all, how were you going to, in fact, push Iran back into the Stone Age? By nuking it. And so, I'm sure you all remember Operation Sindoor was not so long ago. There was a lot of loose talk about using nuclear weapons. Russia used the threat of nuclear weapons in the context of Ukraine. We're very, if you look at, in fact, some of the speeches that were made during the Bandung conference, and I'm particularly reminded of the one made by the Sri Lankan president, I think he was, or prime minister, in which he very much talked about the mutual concern of countries around that table in Bandung who were very, very concerned about the threat of nuclear weapons, the role that, in fact, the whether it was Bandung or whether its successor, the non-aligned movement, played in the non-proliferation treaty, particularly Article 6, as well as in the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I think sometimes we forget these things, that these were active players, that there was even a play for multilateralism at that point in time. I want to pick up a thread that Anuradha raised when she mentioned the Asian Relations Conference, the Afro-Asian Solidarity. Now, she talked about, in fact, the presence of women's collectives and other kind of solidarities. But I want you to take a look at the photographs of Bandung, men in dark suits. Take a look at the photographs of BRICS, men in dark suits, except for that one exception of the Brazilian president for a short period. Otherwise, dark suits. Take a look at, in fact, today's tables. Again, men in dark suits, whether they're from Iran, whether they're from Pakistan, or men in camouflage suits, or whether they are from the US. All men. Where are the women? And this is striking because if you look at 2017 and the nuclear agreement that was agreed upon in 2017, you find, and that was your 5+1, that's Germany, Europe was represented largely by women. US was represented by Ambassador Wendy Sherman. And in fact, there was a predominance of women at that table. Of course, the Iranians had no women present. And they did manage to get to formulate an agreement that stood till Trump tore it out, uprooted it. But what is interesting is statements made by these women when they were asked, what do you think was the contribution of women? And they're quoted by BBC as saying that, well, the men had a tendency to go into these long, winding historical debates, go into technical nitpicking, and it was the women who actually were much more pragmatic, were determined and to be focused to conclude an agreement, which they eventually did. I'm not trying to say that they introduced a complexity into the agreement which made it possible. All I'm saying is I think that the jury is still out on whether the women's presence at the table, not only is it, of course, legitimate in terms of gender equality, but the presence of women at the table, does it make a difference in terms of the values and politics that they bring? Does it, in fact, contribute to complexity of the discussion? But even while recognizing that in Bandung there was no gender, there was, and that there certainly at that point we are ignoring the fact, and it's I think a way that the narrowness with which we look at diplomacy. We look at diplomacy as only something that is done by foreign offices. Diplomacy is done by a great many actors, and I really am greatly indebted to young scholars who are excavating genealogies of diplomacy, which goes beyond, in fact, the formal bounded borders of the Foreign Office. And here, let's look at, in fact, something which is pre-war, and that is the All India Women's Conference. There is a wonderful thesis about to be published on the work of these women. Who are these women? Rajkumari Amrit Kaur, Sarojini Naidu, Sharifa Hamid Ali, a whole lot of women who were engaged in a lot of transnational networking. And on what? Women, war, and peace. These were women who were part of the the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, but a whole host of transnational units. These are women's collectives, and there is a tradition that I would like to draw between the women who were active in the pre-war years to the women who are active today, who are in fact defying borders, who are challenging even at the India-Pakistan level, or at the South Asia level, or in fact at the global north, global south level. Women's collectives, civil society collectives. Manoranjan Mohanty ji and I have just come from the Pakistan India People's Forum for Peace and Democracy, their national convention. And here is a civil society body, a civil society platform, which is very much women-led, and it is extremely determined to defy the hostile state borders. And to carve a different kind of alternate agenda. So although women may be missing from these spaces, and certainly the dark suits dominate, and the sexualized language that is so much in our face these days, but if we look at diplomacy as wider than just the boundaries of a foreign office and career diplomats, no disrespect to the ambassadors sitting here, I think one would recognize that there are a great many other players in the diplomatic sphere. Now, just to more focus on what is it that women bring to, in fact, these debates. I think one of the aspects which is extremely important, without, in fact, corralling women in terms of vulnerability and victimhood, is that they remind us that war is experience, war is suffering. You know, if you look at, in fact, the kind of images, the kind of what you see on, particularly on television or in the audiovisual media, you will find that it's largely a war that's a technocratic war. It's a video game. It's really, yes, you see the collapse of buildings and so forth. You do not see the mangled bodies. You do not see, in fact, the pain of loss. And in a sense, war becomes acceptable. War becomes normalized. War becomes what is today the language of communication between states that have differences. Women remind us, and particularly feminist scholarship has been very influential in contributing that war is experience, war is the politics of injury, war is something that no reparation can compensate for. Yes, bridges will be rebuilt, buildings will be rebuilt, libraries will be rebuilt, but the pain and loss of those children that are killed in schools, those that are killed in hospitals that get bombed, that loss can never be compensated. The other thing that I want to mention is something that I think somebody, maybe again Anuradha mentioned, in terms of sexualized language. You know, we are in the Epstein era, and Epstein has been very much a subtext of this war. And if you remember in early period, then once again they dredged up this old thing of white men saving brown women from brown men. That is, we are going to it's famous Gayatri Spivak quote, that is that we have to save the women of Iran, just as we want to save the women of Afghanistan and of Iraq. But fortunately, that discourse was dropped, and but again, we have this whole issue of the weaponization of gender,
And here it's not only the way that women are used, as we saw in the Operation Sindoor conflict too, when it became a war cry, but it's also the kind of masculinity, toxic masculinity that war, militarization, and militarism, the ideology, promote, which is very much to do with the making. There's a book called The Unmaking of War Requires the Unmaking of Men. This is a toxic masculinity, which of course predicates to a passive femininity, something I reject because I do recognize, and this is what I want to end with, which is the importance of, in fact, women's participation in all decision making, not necessarily because they will bring a different pathway or that they will illuminate a different pathway, but one, because men have been really rather apologetic in the kind of mess that they have made. Women require to be there because they are half the population, and it is likely that they may bring an agenda that is more rooted to life. Thank you. Shall I?
Yeah, thank you. Please go ahead.
I knew there was a tactical advantage in going after Rita because she's at the heart of some of the things that I'm going to talk to you about. Let me begin by saying that I'm probably one of the oldest people around here. I can remember the spirit of Bandung being spoken about in my growing years. I think I was in college at that stage, but also because I was born in the old South Asia. The South Asia is India was South Asia, and I was born at that time. So when we became independent, I was 6 years old, and I saw the partition, and I saw the partition riots, and I saw also the first flag flying. I actually saw that flag going up. So I'm very familiar with nationalism and its dimensions and whatever it is. Now, I want to talk actually about the practice of Bandung. We were not followed that. I don't think any feminist followed it that we are actually practicing Bandung when we tried to establish borderless, easily crossable boundaries in South Asia. And I'll speak only about the South Asian experience because the spirit of Bandung is required not only internationally in the context of China and whatever it is, it's also required in the context of South Asia, which is where we live, in which where our conflicts play out and where our histories pit us often against each other, leading us to use war. We know from the recent war that we've been through, which has actually come at the end of a long series of tensions, that this is South Asia is a region which is both deeply emotionally invested in itself, in the entire region, but it's also deeply fractious in the way in which the politics has gone, which has been completely against the spirit of I would see it as that very much against the spirit of Bandung. So, to some extent, Rita is at the heart of the beginning of my presentation. I want to go back to that conference we had in Kathmandu, where Rita organized, I mean, in the nice way in which feminists have tried to put conflicting groups of people together, particularly flashpoints and across areas within India and around in South Asia. So we had a conference and we were asked to make this is sometimes done as part of the serious venture of map making exercise. So we were making a map. We were told to make maps, and we were particularly put into groups where the flashpoints were to be placed together. So in the Northeast, in Sri Lanka, in other parts of India, Northeast particularly, and some of us who were kind of not particularly from the flashpoint areas, but more generally around there, couple of people from Pakistan, there were certainly people from Nepal, and we decided, we got into an exercise where we also tried to make a map. Okay. Now, what was our map? Our map was a borderless, or let's say soft border kind of South Asia, in which we had no hard borders. We had no, there may have been borders, but we were ignoring it. And we were putting bridges and train tracks and roads that went across on all sides, that is into Bangladesh, into whatever, and into the other, the Punjab region, and imagining a world where we could not be in conflict with each other. We could be living in peace and according to the Panchshila, according to the spirit of Bandung, across amongst our own, in our own neighborhood. And of course, it was, it began by saying we can't do this because there's patriarchy. And patriarchy won't let us. Patriarchy damn well created those borders. They are the ones who fixed it. They said, you can't cross those borders. This is us, this is our nation, this is my country, this is my people, and sovereignty. So we said first we'll have to dunk patriarchy. So patriarchy ko banaya humne aur usko pehla. We sailed him off on the west, on the Indian, not on the Indian Ocean side, but on the West Asia side, on the Maharashtra, coast, that coast. Then we proceeded a little bit, then we created a South Asian Parliament, accessible to all, we created matrilineal homes, we did all sorts of things that were fun, which were not going to make women, the feminist vision of a better world. But then we said we won't be allowed to do this because we have neoliberalism and we have the warring, whatever it is. So then we created WTO, International IMF and all the rest of it, and we made, that was another man, we put him in a coffin and we sailed him off on the other Indian Ocean side. And we said, okay, now we can rebuild our world. I tell you, I say this because in some ways, reimagining a way to be, a way of being with each other without having to be at war endlessly with each other is both the spirit of Bandung, but it's also the spirit of every feminist who understands the meaning of patriarchy, both domestically and across. So it seems to me that that spirit is what we have to re-access. Now, I had opportunities of doing this because I was a part of feminist solidarity. Let's focus on South Asia because South Asia is the area that we worked very effectively on. We were constantly having conferences which brought people in. Famous Kumari Jayavardhane, who would be living the spirit of Bandung in her own personal life and in her political life because she was Sri Lanka, she was, she was the doyen of the feminist thinkers at that point of time. She was among the first people to start off this struggle and this creation of a feminist solidarity. So we constantly held conferences, South Asian conferences. We put out South Asian solidarity statement, feminist statement, and if you were to read it today, it would definitely match the spirit of the Bandung. We also started to cross borders and go across it and teach. I was teaching, and I used to go repeatedly across to Lahore to teach women's studies. And in our women's studies course, we actually, evoked much of the spirit of the old South Asia. Even in the course, we tried to design it in a way in which it reflected the whole of South Asia. And it was quite challenging and exciting to do that experience. But amongst the high points of that, of my crossovers, was a conference that we held in 2001 in Lahore, in the Women's Studies Institute where I used to go and teach. It had a lot of participants from India, but also had Alice Thorner, who came to that conference. It was fantastic from the point of view of the capacity of the feminists to look hard upon their own nationalism and what that nationalism had done. So it was an extraordinary moment because we got
we got up 30 years after the march into Bangladesh. It had and Nigat, who was the dean of the institution, told us that it was an important moment because we were to now recall 71 and what 71 had done. So she plays Nayara Noor's हम तो ठहरे अजनबी इतनी बरसातों के बाद खून के धब्बे मिटेंगे नहीं हम तो ठहरे अजनबी कितनी मुलाकातों के बाद खून के धब्बे मिटेंगे कितनी बरसातों के बाद. And then we sang, we cried, we did all of that stuff, but then we passed a resolution and said, we demanded that the army of Pakistan apologize to the women of Bangladesh for the wrong that they had done. It was a fantastic moment, and I thought to myself, can we do this within our country? Can we do it anywhere else? I mean, how many wrongs how much violence we've inflicted on each other. It's so from the point of view of the feminist, it's not just it's not only the diplomatic maneuvers that we must do those. Those are important because without those diplomatic maneuvers, we won't even be able to slightly influence national policy. But the fact of the matter is that there's actually, and when people to people, Pakistan, India, Friendship Forum, or you go to Bangladesh or whatever, that kind of ethos, how will you build a world which actually looks hard at state politics, nationalism, and its pettiness, and then the violence that it causes to people? How will you look at it? How will you confront it? How will you challenge it? And how will you try and rebuild a world in which those principles are not the one? So it doesn't help if a few feminists go and sit in the bastions of power, diplomacy, and whatever it is. You have to translate it into our lives. It is what we have to feel. If we don't feel ourselves to have the spirit of Bandung, to live in coexistence, how will we, at this point of time, actually acknowledge the wrongs that are happening in front of our very eyes and which we haven't been able to even effectively speak on? Even when Operation Sindoor was happening, the feminists did manage to put up a statement. They managed to stand above the nationalism, the cross-border, yeah. But we did put out a statement, which I think was a genuine acknowledgement of the fact that conflict does not actually lead to any kind of durable, stable relationship that we have amongst ourselves. So it seems to me that the spirit of Bandung would have to actually translate into everyday practices, not only in diplomatic spaces, which too will have to be done. But how do we acknowledge the wrongs that are being done in the name of supposedly creating global, whatever it is, dominance on the one hand, or even retaliation for wrongs to be done to them? I mean, at the end of the day, those images that we see constantly of we saw for 2 years and nobody spoke. Nobody even turned around and said anything at that stage because we were all terrorized by our own nationalism that we can't even speak or we can't take a demonstration today. So at the end of the day, feminists have a vision. How do you translate it into principles that can actually influence the state policy? That's the real challenge as far as I'm concerned.
But to converge, now we're living in a world where global diplomacy is being subjected to the shock and awe assault of unpredictable moves. But in that context, how do you think Bandung is still very relevant, and particularly in the context of itself for the greater leading that transformation back to global good?
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. And to respond to your question directly, let me say that the topic today was women, war, and peace. And I will look at the peace aspect of this of it, particularly from my own lived years in diplomacy, particularly my last 2 years in the United Nations. So let me make 5 quick points. My first point, in my experience, peace is not failing because principles are absent. The principles are there. They are laid out in the United Nations Charter. Of course, earlier, the Bandung principles were also there, and what we are talking about today. So the principles are there. Particularly, if you look at Chapter 1, Article 2 of the United Nations Charter, all the principles are clearly laid out. Sovereign equality of nations, territorial integrity, sovereignty, non-use of force, peaceful settlement of disputes. All of it is there. So what is the problem? The issue is not really a lack of principles, but the gap between commitment and practice. And that is usually the point at which trust begins to erode. And once that happens, even well-established frameworks such as the United Nations become difficult to sustain. My second point, in negotiations, perceived fairness determines outcomes. Now, in multilateral settings, countries are often, in my view, willing to compromise, even on difficult issues, if they believe that the process is even-handed. And that is very important. If they believe that the process is even-handed. Where challenges arise is where there is a perception that similar situations are treated differently. And I've seen negotiations stall, not because positions were irreconcilable, but because confidence in the process had weakened. Let me give you 2 examples with which all of you will be very familiar. Let's look at the Doha round. Now, while, as we all know, while it aimed to address trade barriers and agricultural subsidies, it stalled, largely due to differences between developed and developing countries. The perception that rules favored the wealthier countries and that agricultural protections were not being equally addressed led to a loss of trust. And also let's turn to the UN climate talks before the Paris Agreement. In some of the earlier conference of parties, negotiations stalled because developing countries felt, as they do today, that historical emitters were not applying climate commitments fairly. In these cases, it wasn't that compromise was impossible, but that trust in the fairness of the process had weakened, making agreement far more difficult. My third point, the current conflicts that are raging across the globe, where we see a differentiated application of principles very, very clearly. So if we look across all of the recent conflicts, we see familiar principles being invoked. Sovereignty, territorial integrity, self-defense, humanitarian law, by all countries, without exception, including by India. Variation lies in how these principles are interpreted and enforced. So let's take Ukraine. Ukraine was really quite extraordinary because one of the members of the Security Council was directly involved in the conflict. So what happened? India was in the Security Council at that time, and I had the honor to also be in the Security Council as a consequence. There was absolutely no agreement whatsoever on further course of action to be taken because that one member vetoed all resolutions that would come up regularly for discussion in the UN Security Council. So the countries tasked with the maintenance of peace and security were themselves violating the very principles that they should actually have been enforcing. Similarly, you have a similar example in the case of Gaza. Yet again, principles were invoked in the UN General Assembly Hall, in the United Nations Security Council in the open debates, self-defense, condemnation of terrorism, adherence to international law, especially proportionality and civilian protection. But what happens? Yet again, there was absolutely no agreement in the Security Council on further course of action, simply because another permanent member in the Security Council vetoed all possible solutions. So yet again, you have the involvement of the big powers, the great powers, who should actually be minding the rules, violating the rules themselves. And then let me draw your attention to 2016 and the decision of the Permanent Court of Arbitration. This was the question of maritime law. The decision of the Permanent Court of Arbitration was not adhered to by yet another permanent member of the Security Council, let's be explicit, China, which, by the way, is a signatory of UNCLOS, which is the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and has also ratified it. And finally, of course, you have Iran. Need I say more? All of us are familiar with the situation. The UN Security Council has been completely bypassed. Not that it hasn't met, it has met in emergency, but it has acted more as a pressure valve where countries simply let off steam. But inability to act is very, very stark. So across all these cases, the issue is not the absence of norms, but variation in how they are upheld. And that variation shapes perceptions of fairness. At this point, inconsistency is no longer a legal issue, it becomes systemic. Now, my last point from the vantage position of women, the gap is most visible. As many of the speakers before me have said, women in conflict situations, they are perhaps the most impacted and affected. Let's look at displacement during conflict. Women and children constitute nearly 70% of displaced populations globally, according to the United Nations. Food security, let's take a look at that. In many conflict settings, women are the first to reduce consumption and the last to eat. Healthcare. Maternal and reproductive health services are often among the first to be disrupted. And if you look at protection risks, incidents of gender-based violence increase significantly in conflict and displacement environments. Let's do a bit of case grounding. Let's look at Ukraine. In Ukraine, large numbers of women have crossed borders as refugees, as we all know, often as primary caregivers managing households in conditions of prolonged uncertainty. In Gaza, women face layered vulnerability, displacement, overcrowding, limited access to sanitation, and severe constraints on medical care. And in parts of Africa and West Asia, conflict has disrupted local economies, placing additional pressure on women to sustain families and fewer resources and reduced income opportunities. So for women, the consequences of uneven application of principles are not measured purely or should not be measured purely in legal or diplomatic terms, but in outcomes. I think this is something that Ms. Manchanda alluded to when she said that war is experienced. Now, whether there is food on the table, access to healthcare, physical safety, basic dignity, depends not on the existence of norms, but on how consistently they are applied. And this is where the gap between principle and practice becomes most visible, and I would say also most consequential. Now, looking ahead to BRICS, I would say a pragmatic approach is very much the need of the hour. As India prepares to host the summit, expectations need to be framed realistically, because BRICS countries are not outside the system. They're part of it. They participate in the UN system and in some cases are directly involved in ongoing geopolitical tensions. Therefore, the question is not whether BRICS can redefine global norms entirely. A more practical question, according to me, would be where can the BRICS contribute to greater consistency in application? That's the question for me. For example, maybe coordination on humanitarian access or predictability in development financing and debt frameworks or incremental reform of multilateral institutions. or even cooperation on energy stability and supply chains. So here, credibility will come from consistency in specific areas, not just from broad declarations. So as I conclude, I would say the Bandung principles remain relevant, as most of the speakers before me have said. The challenge today lies in their application. Because in the end, peace is sustained not by the principles we proclaim, but by the consistency with which we apply them. I will also make one additional point, and I think this is important because, so therefore, what's the solution? If the principles are there, but they are being violated or being selectively enforced, what is the way out? Well, I'm afraid whichever way you look at it, we have to reform our institutions. That is the answer, according to me. For example, if you reform and expand institutions, multilateral institutions, for example, take the UN Security Council, you bring more voices into the decision-making process. And with such more diverse perspectives shaping enforcement, it's harder for rules to be selectively applied, I would say. I would argue that it's harder for rules to be selectively applied. Of course, the aim is not perfect enforcement. Perhaps that's not possible, but more equitable, more predictable, and fairer application. Because when more regions have a stake in shaping decisions, principles are more likely to be upheld for all. Thank you. Back to you.
We invite Professor Vasanthi Raman, please.
Thank you very much for inviting me here for this wonderful symposium. Being the last speaker is advantageous and yet challenging as well. So I would like to make 2 or 3 points. One is to point out that despite all the negative situation that apparently is in front of us, wars and a ceasefire which we don't know whether it operates or not, yet I would say that this is still a very important, significant opportunity for the progressive forces to be able to work for peace. I would say that the world is turning on its axis somewhat in favor of the world's people. The Bandung Conference was a historic step to consolidate the voices and aspirations of the Afro-Asian peoples. The initiative has continued to inspire many voices across the world, captured in a socio-political and ideological constellation called the Bandung Spirit Community. The challenges that a large part of the global South have faced over the last decade since the 1980s are multiple and multi-dimensional. While one is talking about the Bandung spirit and one is talking about the problems right now, I would like to focus on what is the global system that has led to this thing, the global political system. The onset of a paradigmatic shift has occurred over the last couple of decades of the 20th century, with the onset of globalization strategies, with the compliance of the dominant sections of the social and political classes. The neoliberal paradigm that has swept across the world is intrinsically a polarizing one. I think this is something we need to emphasize, that it's not a matter of a little there and a little here. Whatever development has happened, and it is extremely violent, and it has been based on dispossession and pauperization of large majority of the peoples. So it's intrinsically a polarizing one. The decline of the welfare state being integral to it, wherein large-scale pauperization and exacerbation of the existing fault lines based on religion, ethnicity, race, and class, and the strengthening of patriarchy and
stifling of democracy. All this is one package. We cannot choose in this. The inciting of local wars, while a wave of majoritarianism, authoritarianism, and racism threatens the social lives and peace and harmony across the world, reviving various forms of patriarchy have become also intrinsic to this paradigm. I would like to say that the whole issue of gender itself has become weaponized, because it is not something as though when we say, yes, we need to have women, but we need to know what kind of women do we want to have, and therefore a consensus on the kind of future that we all would like. And when we say women, it's not only obviously for women, it's for the world at large. So reviving the various forms of patriarchy has become intrinsic to this paradigm. The other important thing is which has been with us now for the last 20, 30 years, the destruction of the environment and the ensuing climate crisis is integral as well to this neoliberal strategy. One cannot, of course, but mention the genocidal war of the people of Palestine and the current war of the US and Israel against Iran. Internationally, there is a move towards a total rejection of a unipolar unipolar world with the US as the dominant pole, and one in favor of a multipolarity wherein different countries have the options to follow their diverse futures. I believe the present historical moment, despite all its ifs and buts, and despite the zigzag that the peace process is undergoing right now, the present historical moment offers us a rare opportunity. In a sense, women are kind of uniquely positioned to be initiating a movement for peace and denuclearization, for saving the environment and ensuring the planet's future. When again, with a point that has been made by Anuradha, which is that women are not one homogeneous lot, and therefore the need to bring together various voices, but the priorities have to be, and that has been reiterated also. Rita mentioned the Pakistan-India the annual convention that we had, national convention. They reiterated all these, and many conferences that we have had across the borders have said that we need to push this, and it has to be done not just at a national level, but at a South Asian and the subcontinental level. Women, because they've been victims of environmental destruction, and they have also played at the same time a stellar role in the battle against the COVID. So in a sense, one would say that yes, women have to play a critical role and take the lead, because as points that have been made by others, they experience the war in very real terms, in terms of their lives, in terms of the lives of their near and dear ones, and the attempts to keep the families together. I would think that one of the first steps that could be taken at the subcontinental level is to initiate a coordination of forces at the South Asian level for peace, for denuclearization, and talks across the border with Pakistan, with our other neighbors, so that we can, first of all, to start a process whereby we can at least talk. We need to meet. We need to meet to talk. Right now, the situation is such that it's very difficult for us to meet. And the only thing we can do is talk on Zoom. And this process should be strengthened. And also to realize that women, again, to say, gender itself has become weaponized. And therefore, in a situation that we are, where forces
of authoritarianism, to put it mildly, the neoliberal, what should I say, the convergence of neoliberalism with forces of the right wing have made the situation extremely difficult for India and thereby also for South Asia. So therefore, I think it would be useful to start a process of negotiation amongst us, ideas amongst us, to be able to meet freely across the borders and to be able to speak for a future which is not tied to the neoliberal paradigm that we are in. So I would like to emphasize that we can talk about this piece only when we are able to address also side by side the issues of the vast majority of our peoples who have been dispossessed and who have been pauperized. And I would also like to say that in this whole discussion, the emphasis on diplomacy is extremely important, and to be able to work for a peace in such a difficult situation requires a lot of skills, and I think we have to be ready for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, after this very thought-provoking presentations and discussion, I now invite Dr. Ritusha Mani Tiwari for comments. Difficult to capture all of this discussion, but then I'm sure you'll rise to the challenge.
Well, thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. Broadly looking at the arguments that the 6 speakers have laid out for us, I would like to summarize it in the form of a singular hypothesis. And I seek your pardon beforehand if I'm not able to really rise to that challenge of summarizing everybody's argument. But my hypothesis, as it stands today, after listening to everyone, is rather simple. It is that while Bandung symbolized anti-colonial solidarity, women were often invisible in the elite diplomacy of it. BRICS opens up new spaces, but it still reproduces patriarchal and state-centric geopolitics. And therefore, a feminist global South peace agenda remains unfinished. That's a singular hypothesis with which I tie down the arguments of each of the speakers before us. And let me explain this hypothesis in 3 brief moves. The first one is where Bandung emerges as a promise as well as a paradox. The Bandung Conference is remembered as a foundational moment of Global South. Leaders from newly independent Asian and African countries came forward and came together to reject colonial domination, racial hierarchies, and Cold War bloc politics. It was a powerful vision of sovereignty, solidarity, and peaceful coexistence. And yet, Bandung was also deeply elite and masculine. The stage was dominated by male heads of state and male diplomatic networks. Women participated in anti-colonial struggles across Asia and Africa as organizers, as workers, as intellectuals, and yet their community leadership, their voices were rarely centered in formal diplomacy. And I think this concern was raised by Professor Chinoy, it was raised by Ambassador Shankar, it was raised by, in different manners and different forms, all the other speakers. And so even at the birth of the Third World Solidarity and Third World Internationalism, there was a gap between liberation rhetoric and gendered inclusion. The second brief move that I would like to project here is that from Bandung to BRICS, the expansion happened without transformation. Today, BRICS represents another important Global South platform. It challenges Western domination or dominance in finance, development, and governance. Through institutions like New Development Bank, BRICS seeks multipolarity and greater representation of the Global South, which matters immensely. However, BRICS politics largely remains driven by state interests, strategic competition, security calculation, and great power bargaining. This language itself, whether it's camouflaged or put under the rubrics of development, still overlooks the unpaid care work, gendered labor precarity, displacement, and everyday insecurity. Women may be visible in summits or side forums, but decision making structures still remain overwhelmingly state centric and patriarchal. So that still, presents a big problematic in front of us. My third brief case is why peace must be refined. A feminist perspective reminds us that peace is not only the absence of war or military conflict. Peace also means ecological freedom. It means exclusion should be at the core of debate, that we need to replace it with inclusion. It must also bring to center freedom from poverty, hunger, domestic violence, economic dependency. And if the global south wants to build a just world order, it cannot rely merely upon geopolitical balancing. It must include social justice. It must include the agenda of redistribution, of care economies, and women's substantive participation in agenda setting. So my conclusion to the hypothesis is that Bandung gave us the dream of solidarity. BRICS gives a new institutional possibility, but neither automatically delivers gender justice. The project of Global South, order making, remains incomplete until women are not simply the symbolic participants, but are equal co-architects of peace itself. And I leave with two questions. Can the BRICS genuinely claim to represent the global south when women, grassroots movements, marginalized communities remain peripheral to the strategic vision as well as decision-making language? And the second question is, when women are central to the liberation struggles, why are they often absent from diplomatic memory, from textbooks and summit leadership? Thank you so much.
That was a brilliantly knit tapestry of very many rich ideas. Thank you very much. Now, may I open it up for discussion? But before I do, may I request Ambassador Shansel, please, to go ahead with his comments.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Reddy, and I would like to thank Professor Mohanty for collaborating with us to bring this Bandung anniversary event to fruition. And I'm very happy that this particular forum has focused attention on the very important issue of gender equality. All very, I think, thought-provoking comments have been made, and I'm particularly happy to welcome my colleagues, Ambassador Mira Shankar and Ruchira Kamboj, who have worked together with me several years in the Foreign Service, and also others whom I have had occasion to work with. Let me just make a few comments. One is that there is a kind of shall I say, disconnect between our discourse about equality and sovereignty or territorial integrity or even the issue of development and the fact that none of these concepts of peace, security, and development can really have much meaning unless there is a very, very clear and explicit gender dimension. This is something which has been talked about again and again, but I think what is perhaps depressing is that the world seems to have degenerated back into a kind of a state of patriarchy in a very, very, very real sense. But this is not only in terms of international affairs, but I think we see this very much, in our own countries, where I would say that, for example, as far as India is concerned, politics today is, in fact, seeing a kind of a regression, a kind of a diminution of the very, very real rights that have been won by women of this country over the last so many years. I think the freedom movement in India was really very important because this was the first occasion where there was, for a national cause, there was equal participation by the women of this country. But that particular participation and their contribution was perhaps not fully recognized in independent India. So it is a matter of worry that not only in India but in many other countries, this kind of a rightward lurch that we have seen has also very, very, very clearly led to the kind of, shall I say, dilution of many of the rights which have been won by women over the last several years. And how we address this is going to be a very important issue. So as far as the BRICS is concerned, I would hope that some of the debate in our own country, for example, with regard to the women's reservation, the whole concept of Nari Shakti, which has been talked about. Perhaps some of that can also get reflected in the deliberations of the BRICS, because India, as the host country, will have a considerable leeway in determining what the agenda of the BRICS would be. I think just drawing attention to the fact that so many of the conflicts which are taking place in the world today, whether it is Gaza or whether it is Iran or Sudan, for example, a forgotten conflict. In all these, what we see very, very clearly is that the worst sufferers, in fact, are women and children. I don't think we should forget that when we are talking about the suffering of women, almost inevitably it is paired with the suffering of children as well. These are almost are linked together. So how we address that is something very important. Important point which was made was that there is a certain sanitization of violence. That even if you look at the media reporting on many of these conflicts, the focus is so much on like a video game kind of reporting of these conflicts, and not really looking at and not exposing to the world the real scale of suffering, not only of women and children, but innocent men, women, and children. I would say. So that's something new that we see today. The kind of image during the Vietnam War of this young girl running naked when the napalm bombs are falling, something like that is almost impossible to see. Not that those images are not there, but that those images are not, in fact, exposed. So how we deal with this is a very difficult issue. I personally believe that governments will not be able to do this. This has to be something which has to come from the people themselves, from civil society, and that is why fora like this, in fact, are very important because they at least bring some attention back to issues that really matter. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Madison. Now, I can open it up for discussion. Any questions, comments? Yeah. Please go ahead. Take the mic.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Aisha Atrik from Shamlal College Evening, pursuing B Honours Political Science. And my question is to Ambassador Meera Shankar. Ma'am, my question is, despite global commitments, why does women participation in peace processes often remain symbolic, and what prevents real power sharing? Thank you.
Take a couple of.
Maybe we'll take a few questions and we'll give each of the panelists to respond. Opportunity.
Okay, I am Nupur Ray. I'm a faculty at Kamla Nehru College. My question is to, anybody on the panel can answer. It is something that has emerged in terms of, highlighting the paradox that has come up in some of the. So one that was pointed out by Rita ji in terms of looking at the masculinized, nature of the war narrative itself, rather the hyper masculinized nature, and therefore the need of politics of presence of women. So not just in inclusivity in terms of the forces in decision making, but just being included in terms of their voices, their agency, and understanding war as an experience. But on the other hand, we also had Professor Chun pointing out a very important contradiction where we see now and some alarming concerns around where women in uniform or administration or in higher bureaucratic spaces on the other side of the hegemonic forces taking sides and making comments and taking decisions which are harming women and which are perhaps almost appropriating to the same hyper masculinized nature of the war narrative. So therefore, this contradiction is almost like posing not just a theoretical challenge, but a real challenge in terms of feminist praxis as to how do we, resolve this. So some reflections on that would be useful. Thank you.
Okay, a gentleman there.
Yeah, good afternoon. Namaskar. Assalamu alaikum. My name is Milun Kothari. I'm a human rights scholar activist, and until recently I was commissioner with the UN Independent Commission on Palestine and Israel. My comment is, and a question following, is what happened to the Bandung spirit? Where have we come as a country? I think many of you saw the great exhibition on Korea downstairs. Our whole role, positive role in the decolonization committee, we were one of the first to recognize Palestine as a state. And now we are sort of nowhere as a country. I'm actually ashamed to be an Indian right now because we have not spoken out appropriately against the genocide in Gaza. We have not challenged or named the atrocities being committed by the United States and Israel, and we have not spoken out against the absolutely brutal genocide that is still going on, including our commission did a report on sexual violence in Gaza, so the question is, we have violated the Genocide Convention. The question is, unless our country changes track and goes back to defending the South, goes back to an anti-imperialist perspective. I don't know if you can go back to being a leader of the South. We are not anymore. I think it's a pretense to say that. So my question to the panelists is, what happened? What happened to India? What happened to our country? And how can we take it back? Thank you.
Thank you. There's a gentleman there.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Sachin. I'm from Shamlal College Evening BCom Honors. My question is, the principle affirm human rights and sovereignty. When women flee war across borders, whose responsibility are they? The home state or the host state or the whole global South collectively?
We'll take one question from here. And this
As just Akri
Actually, the subjects under discussion are all global, super duper, and astounding. They require a lot of time to clarify them. I will begin with Mahatma Gandhi's victim. When the first atom bomb was dropped on Hiroshima on 6th August 1945, Gandhiji's initial reaction was, bomb cannot be destroyed by counter bomb, even as violence by counter violence. How this worthy hall feels about this Gandhian thought, idiom, and ideology. Because even today, according to the Ford Foundation, 100 conflicts are going on in the world today. According to SIPRI yearbook, about 35 major conflicts are going on in the world today. Even United Nations peacekeeping forces are working in 13, 14 countries. So take one issue, human rights apart, sovereignty apart, decolonization, even after the formation of UNO, 80 countries were decolonized. So all these are big issues. I think it would be worthwhile if this worthy gathering of intellectuals and speakers brings out a fine paper on these pressing issues which are troubling the statesmanship, which are troubling the public intellectuals of this world at this critical juncture.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir, for urging us to go utterly back to Bandung, but forward to Gandhi.
This is actually building upon what you just said about our position as people who belong to the global south and very much did. There is one thing that the state might change its opinion or not, but enough damage has been done in the country for the citizens to actually internalize whatever is happening. And we are seeing that there was a Pew survey which said that only 38% of Indians thought that what's happening in Gaza, the genocide that's happening, is something that needs to be, it doesn't have to happen. There should not be a genocide. And that's the only public opinion only says 38%. And that's a survey. And we're seeing that social media, so many channels are being run here that are supporting the narrative that is completely backed by Zionist sentiment. How do we, the feminist spirit that we're talking about, we can have the state shift with the kind of economic repercussions that we are seeing of the crisis that is happening in very real terms with the cylinder and everything. That can happen. We are tired of many other things that the country is economically facing and other kind of challenges. It seems almost impossible to change this sentiment. So it's not even like, I know there are no answers to what is being asked, like no concrete answers, but because people who are sitting here have been seeing things happen and our youth is gone in just witnessing violence and seeing more of it happen. What sense do we make of the citizens around us, not just the state, but the citizens around us who very comfortably back this narrative? Thanks. I'm Anjali.
Okay, good. Okay, right. We'll have to give the speakers also a chance to respond. But anyway, make your questions brief, please. Questions, not short speeches, if I may. Please.
Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Pooja, and I am a faculty at Dayal Singh College, University of Delhi, and I am also pursuing PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University. My question is to Ruchika ma'am, sorry. So, ma'am, you have mentioned about that, like, in United Nations. And sorry, my PhD topic is also affiliating with, like, I'm working on United Nations lawmaking on violence against women in the public and private spheres. So, ma'am, you have mentioned about that norms are there and principles are there. So, I want to know specifically about what kind of role of bureaucracy, UN bureaucracy, is playing at United Nations Security Council on violence against women. So, if you can, like, just help.
Thank you. And the third one,
I wanted to inform to this August gathering, April 24th happens to be the Women's Political Empowerment Day to celebrate the presence of 1 million women in the panchayat and how they are doing. My question to the panelists is that we are passing through a turbulent period of war-torn turbulent period. What is the role of Security Council of UNO? Thank you.
Any other questions here?
Yeah, my question to Madam Ruchira Bose. Madam, the way you try to focus about UN failing because of its implementation, principles are okay. So the way we have postmortem of our past, suppose if we think of future, like maybe next time, maybe a Taiwan may be a problem. So can we think of a United Nations majority woman decision maker instead of men? Because this failure of men, these things are happening. If we give a chance to women, maybe 100%, what will happen?
Okay, we'll take this as the last question because we'll have the speakers also for this.
Good afternoon to all of you. My name is Shivam Marar. I am from Samlal College Evening, currently pursuing undergraduate bachelor degree. So my question to Uma ma'am, how relevant are the principle of Bandung Conference 1955 in today's multipolar world, especially with the rise of BRICS? Thank you, ma'am.
And thank you for a very concise question. You are the role model for that. So we shall proceed with the speakers' responses to the various questions. They can reflect not only on the questions that were posed to them, but observe also on any of the comment on any of the observations of the other speakers.
I think the question which was addressed to me was, why is it that, from Bandung and then onwards towards peace processes, we find that women are not represented adequately. I think the main reason is really the role or place that women occupy in the society, polity, and economy of individual countries and the world. It flows from that. If you look at India, for instance, I think we have fewer women working today than in the past because a lot of women in agriculture have been displaced by mechanization. And then yet you have the contradictory aspect that women are more visible in spaces where they weren't visible before. For instance, in the army or in the police. You never saw a woman in police uniform as I was growing up. And now you see them everywhere from CRF constables. And these are not just, elite women for whom there are no barriers, but people from villages, people from rural India. And yet at the same time, you see, what could I say, an expansion of violence against women in public spaces, trying to push them back. Because there is this fear, what is going to happen to the patriarchy in a sense if women really take up the space that they should be occupying, and they are not. And I think the first principle would really be to have more economic independence for women. Because unless you're economically independent and can stand on your own feet, you don't even have the wherewithal to really try to play a role. Secondly, more representation for women at all levels of governance institutions, more representation for women in leadership roles in the economy, including in business, where, for instance, the reservation of one independent woman, not reservation, but the mandate that there should be one independent woman director in the 500 top companies in India, actually forced the companies, after much groaning and reluctance and, hedging, to implement it. And then they found that it wasn't that the glass crashed or that, there was some great turmoil because women directors had been brought in, and many found it actually increases diversity of opinion in the boardroom. So you need this at all levels of society, and the role that women will play in international politics will, in a sense, flow from the role they play within their own societies. You can't have this, kind of top down where you say, oh, we want 40% for women or 50% in international institutions, but at the national level you have 10% or 9%. How is that going to flow? So I think it requires also a huge shift in mental attitudes, not just of women themselves, because quite often you see that they limit themselves and actually look at themselves from the point of view of a male gaze, which is actually always strikes me very, very much if I find a woman sending a sexual joke about women. So how can somebody do that? You're a woman. But the point is, we have been indoctrinated to look at ourselves from the point of view of the male gaze. And how do we shape that? How do we shape the attitudes of our boys? Because they are now growing up in this culture of toxic masculinity. You had a culture in the freedom struggle where women came out, they were encouraged to come out. It was reformist. It was trying to change social attitudes. It was trying to make India a better society. And now we find that that reformist impulse has gone. And in fact, across the world, including the US, where you see the retraction of Roe v. Wade, which gave abortion rights to US women, it's been, withdrawn by the Supreme Court. So you really are seeing a period where the gains which were made by the feminist movement are being, in a sense, sought to be pushed back. They are not fully being pushed back because it's going to be a constant tug of war. 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. But I think we have to be at it. That's all I can say. We have to be at it. And then it reaches a certain tipping point. Once there's a volume, it reaches a certain tipping point. Can't be ignored anymore. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions. The first question I want to address was the issue that was raised on how women are being co-opted, and I think Meera's partially addressed that, into masculinist roles, because here there is a dilemma for the women's movement, because on the one hand we do want representation. Second, we do want an autonomy of choice. We want an autonomy of choice to be in the army, and therefore once you join it, it is maybe shooting another woman and harming another woman. So there are these paradoxes and contradictions, but at the same time, I think somewhere we have to see that we need both. We have to make our own choices. The movements have to make their choices of wanting representation, but also having a possibility of a politics of rupture. That we do not want that kind of, if you can be co-opted and then you be, status, but you don't say that you're a feminist, because that's a politics of liberation and emancipation and not harming other women and not harming other women and children. So I think for women, we require both choices. I would support that you need that strategic autonomy where you make a choice whether you want to be in the army, whether you want to be a representative, a spokesperson for President Trump or any other authoritarian, or you want to be on the streets like the Iranian women are today, supporting the state at this point, even though they had issues. So that is what I call the politics of rupture. So I hope that addresses that. And I think Milun raised a very important question, Milun, on where is the Bandung spirit. And I said, just like Mira said, I think movements, whether it's a women's movement or whether it's a nationalist movement or whether it's a human rights movement, it's never unilinear. There are always backlashes and very severe ones. And I think as far as the Bandung spirit is concerned, we're facing a backlash where our position as a state today is to be a great power, which means project power, even if it's, maybe 80% performance. You can make your own judgment on that. There is a theater about it. And to be transactional, to see what benefits the strategic elite, what benefits the regime. And in that, human rights is not a criteria. In fact, it's an obstacle. Just like the imperialist, colonialist said in what I quoted in the 1955 meeting of the UN Human Rights, and you would know because you've been part of that, where both Europe and France said this human rights is not for the former colonies because they're not civilized, and there'll be an obstacle. There will be an obstacle. There'll be a problem towards our development. So similarly, human rights today is an obstacle towards a kind of development choices we've made. So I think that's how much I could address it. And lastly, whose responsibility are the refugees? Sadly, no one's. And I think it's one of the greatest tragedies of our time because there are over some 100 million refugees, out of which 80% are women and children.
Pastor Kamboj.
Thank you. There were 3 questions directed at me, so I'll attempt to answer them quickly. One is the role of the UN bureaucracy on violence against women. Did I get you right? Well, let me tell you that the United States is member state driven. As simple as that. The states lead the process. I think this is very often a misnomer about the UN bureaucracy. The bureaucracy is there to support, as any other bureaucracy in any other part of the world. And like any other bureaucracy, the UN bureaucracy too is quite slow, bureaucratic. Of course, it cannot be ruled out that the UN bureaucracy is also politicized to a large extent. And it is true, we have encountered that in our various tenures at the United Nations, big states, middle powers courting the UN bureaucracy. But at the end of the day, every document that is produced by the United Nations Secretariat, by the UN bureaucracy, is placed before member states. So the member states lead the process. The second point was about the role of the UN Security Council in war and peace. I'm glad this question was asked. And the answer to that is really that it is indeed a pity that the body that is tasked with the maintenance of international peace and security is unable to do so. There is no doubt about that. It has failed there completely. In fact, I'm one of the people who believe that as far as the UN's peace and security mandate is concerned, the UN is a failure today, a spectacular failure, if I may say so. But in other areas, the UN is doing quite well. But in those areas, no one actually really pays attention to that because it's peace and security that must be up front and center. And the UN is unable to perform that role. So therefore, the solution lies quite frankly in a reform of the institutions. They were quite frankly created for a different time and era. Today, the world is multipolar, as most of us agree, and that multipolarity must be reflected in the membership of the United Nations Security Council. Therefore, there is a great need to bring in players from the global south into the council so that there's greater democracy and diversity of voices on the table. The point I earlier made in my own presentation that if there are more voices shaping the perspective, then rules are more likely to be enforced. Of course, it's not a perfect recipe, but it will be much, much better. Then, of course, I think you mentioned that give a chance to women and perhaps they do a better job as far as peace is concerned. Well, studies actually do point to that. There is a very notable United Nations study that says that whenever women have been involved in peace processes, those processes are much more likely to hold because women are believed to be more inclusive in their approach. aside from other attributes. So it's a good idea, it's a good thought. I wish that would happen much more easily. For instance, in the United Nations, there is very often a momentum or a wish to have a woman as the United Nations Secretary General, but it has never quite happened. So let's wait and watch and see what happens. Two other points that were made were about what happened to the Bandung spirit and also the relevance of Bandung principles today. So I'd just like to link both of these to my own intervention on war and peace. The principles are there, they are intact. There is no doubt about that. And they are part of the UN Charter, which is a legal treaty. All 193 countries have signed on to the UN Charter. So the principles are intact, but it is the uneven application or the selective enforcement that really makes all of us doubt the system today. Trust is eroding, and therefore, as far as the UN is concerned, nobody quite believes in the UN today. So it's not that the Bandung principles are not relevant. They are the most relevant today when we talk about peace, when we talk about equality and so forth. It's just that the principles are not being applied evenly. So to both of them, I would say the solution again has to lie in a reform of the institutions. You have to reform the institutions. And how that will happen, when that will happen, is something that has to be seen. But it is not something that people are not talking about. So, as they say, let's continue to watch that space. And my last point really was when we say that about India, I think, you talked about India and its positioning. Well, I can tell you very quickly, as far as Ukraine and Gaza are concerned, our positions in the United Nations were sometimes criticized by some, but you have to be very practical about it. And let me tell you that very often, many of us who are not actually making the decisions don't have the full picture. So there is a lot that has to be taken into account. And in today's world, I can tell you from my own experience at the United Nations, many, many countries actually abstained both on Gaza and Ukraine. Refusal to take sides in a conflict that they felt was not theirs. So it's not just India, and there's statistics to back this. As the conflicts have increasingly continued over time, many countries in the United Nations General Assembly have increasingly abstained. So abstentions are increasing, and increasingly many countries, the smaller states, the developing countries of the South, feel that they do not wish to be drawn into a conflict that is not theirs. So it's not just India. Thank you.
I will just add a little to what Ruchira said about the Security Council. I think the Security Council not only reflected the world as it emerged after the World War, but its functioning was, could I say, constrained right from the beginning because of the ideological divisions into blocks and the veto power that the 5 permanent members have. So as long as there were some issues on which the great powers could reach consensus, you could get a consensus agreement or a resolution, for instance, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, where the great powers had the similar objective of controlling horizontal proliferation by other countries while continuing to grow their own arsenals. You could find agreement. Where there was division, there was never any agreement. And that has actually exacerbated with the growing competition between the great powers. So I think along with expansion of the Security Council, some reform of the veto is perhaps certainly required as far as the UN Security Council is concerned. And clearly all countries, when we're talking about where has the Bandung spirit gone, certainly I think as a nation, that headiness of post-independence India, that confidence that we could change everything for the better, I think that to some extent has evaporated into a degree of cynicism. It happens with all states. You see that in that revolutionary moment or transformational moment, there is an energy, there is a moral purpose, there's a clarity. And as the, what could I say, the day-to-day vicissitudes of actual democratic functioning take over, that tends to become much less effervescent, much less at the fore. Idealism gets replaced increasingly by pragmatism. Now, in a world which is pragmatic, which is driven by transactional, relationships increasingly, it's difficult for any one country to really have a policy based purely on principles or values. But at the same time, I would say that a pragmatic policy devoid of all values is also not desirable. So for a country like India, your credibility will depend on the skill with which you can harmonize your interests and your values. Without abandoning one or the other, because national interest will determine that you need X or Y, and at the same time your values may be in conflict. But how do you harmonize this without abandoning one or the other fully? And that is where the skill of your diplomacy is going to lie, but it also flows from the overall stance which the country has adopted in terms of its own policies and worldview and so on. So, thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Now may I request the speakers from this side to respond if there are any questions that they would like to address.
I address the one question that was addressed to me. I'll make some additional comments from the point of view of the questions that have come up and the answers. I think one of the problems running is to mechanically substitute woman with feminist. That doesn't work because women are, they're ideologically, materially, and in so many critical ways, constructs of the same system that men are. And so to that extent, it's not, I'm not sure that we can expect really progressive feminist thinking, which has been critical in reshaping our idea of not only peace, but also of the way the world should be ordered, in the environmental movement and so on. There are major areas where we have been able to, I think in a way that is far ahead of the way normal, let's say, political scientists or international relations experts and all think. So that's one thing that I'd like to state. I also think that it's, when we're assessing this failure of the Bandung spirit, perhaps, and we're doing it at the level of the international agencies. To an extent, I would not even want to go so far as to go on putting all my energies in the UN and the UN system, because we can see how contradictory that whole history has been. It may have begun with a certain kind of energy and ideological thrust, but it seems to have become something which is whatever. But even in the recent developments, if you look at the way in which parallel institutions or parallel structures were speaking, I'm reminded of the massive effort that was made. I'm not very good at remembering the detail of this, but massive effort that was made by many member countries to actually bring Gaza and the Palestinian, the actions of Israel onto the table. That was a massive moment in which people did speak up. There were lots of people who spoke up, and the lead was taken by people from South Africa who had themselves suffered historic injustice over. So they were more sensitive to some extent. I think that's the direction. We can also look in that direction. It's not that we've all sold out. It's not that we've all said, okay, what Trump is doing or what Israel is doing is fine. It's not, because there are people across the world who are speaking up. And so
International Criminal Court.
Yeah, and the International Criminal Court. Now look at the work that the feminists did in the International Criminal Court. To my mind, just the idea of command responsibility that they put on the table. And I can think of two women, Rhonda Copeland on the one hand, and Judge Navneetam Pillai from South Africa on the other. They executed a judgment which actually indicted the army for its mass rape of women. So it seems to me that there are ways in which we have to look from the point of view of what is the feminist way in which you'll do this, and the feminist way, in my understanding, is also the humanist way, and the Bandung principles, I think, if there are Bandung principles anywhere at all, and I think it's there in the feminist movement, and the women let's disaggregate women from the point of view of women who may have to play certain kinds of roles, and feminists who do lead in thinking and in critically engaging, and that we have not stopped doing. I think that answers your question.
Thank you, Professor Manchita.
Thank you. I want to take Milan and Anjali's question together. There has, and I think you're well aware, there has been this very strong rightward shift in our politics. But I would like to accent also the fact that there's been such a huge securitization of the discourse, whether it has to do with refugees, whether it has to do with security, just basic security. It's this nexus between militarization, militarism, and authoritarianism. I mean, where is the freedom? Where is there the space to express dissent on foreign policy? You're well aware that it's an extremely expensive protest. The consequences of that protest, whether it's on Gaza, whether it's a very limited scope, and therefore, I find it ironic that in the BRICS, there is a statement. I don't even know what the official, what the nomenclature of that statement is. It's an official government statement that the accent on the BRICS summit in September will be humanity and people to people. The irony of the government saying this when people to people links are being constrained all throughout, when the whole issue of humanity, humanitarian morality is in fact something that we all know is highly questionable in terms of the position. But I would accent that a lot of the securitization that we have seen, whether we were talking about health, whether we're talking about refugees, any subject you can think of, including food security, the result has been much, much greater authoritarianism, much greater erosion of the human rights of people to actually speak out and protest. When you talk about, such a small percentage of people who actually see something wrong with the policy in Gaza, it is because the kind of protest, the no kings type protest that you see in North America or in universities, they're now all constrained. It means that they don't have access to an alternative discourse to be able to rethink what exactly is happening in Gaza. But I'd also like to, I have an issue with this women and children thing. This dyad is actually very dangerous because what it does is it undermines our argument about women's full representation. Because if you see them only as women and children, then you are firstly bracketing them in a vulnerable category of victims, category of passivity, category of the disempowered. And I really, therefore, find it extremely uncomfortable when we bracket the two. Women in peace processes, the reason that the Columbia process was so successful was that there was a linkage between the women who were at the table and the grassroots women. Unless there is that linkage, I have often asked, in fact, our diplomats that when they are promoting certain issues which are controversial, do they in fact take the support of civil society, not only our own civil society, but civil societies in the countries where they are posted to actually promote some of that agenda? I mean, I am reiterating this. One has to recognize diplomacy exists beyond the corridors of the Foreign Office. And finally, the refugee question. You know, the sad thing is because we have so securitized the refugee question, the actual humanitarian aspect, the humanitarian response has been completely undermined.
Well, you see, I mean, I was very struck by the question, where is we want the country back, is what has happened to the country, which means really finally we are the same question. It is part of a larger syndrome, but it is also part of large sections of our third world elites, ruling classes, whatever you would like to call them. It has been a surrender to the neoliberal paradigm. So whatever the whole ideology of the welfare state of a nation building project itself has been sidelined. So in that sense, what you would say is that here is a system, it deadens your conscience. Finally, there is a deadening of the conscience. Now, a lot depends. You had leaders of the stature of Nehru, Nasser, Sukarno, and others who yes, and Nkrumah too, definitely. Sorry? Yes. Nkrumah, yes. And they were there, they were actually our leading lights for so many years, for so many decades. But that part, we have actually, this is the point I was trying to make. It says that since the 80s onwards, there is a paradigmatic shift and in our whole perception of development. And so this is where that we will finally have to really confront the neoliberal beast, I must say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Monti had very generously allotted about 10 minutes for me to make my comments, but recognizing the constraints on time, I'll be very, very brief. It's very clear that one of the things that has happened is that the omissions of Bandung have come back to haunt us, where gender, environment, technology, these issues were omitted. And we're seeing not only about what the consequences are in terms of gender and environment, which have been talked about, but even how technology is now in the grip of many forces which are inimical to human welfare. And where also we are seeing that technological assets are being hoarded and many other countries in the global south are being disadvantaged. So obviously, we cannot fault Bandung retrospectively, but these are areas that need to be addressed now. But the second, I think, is the most important consensus that has come about today is that if we're really thinking about restructuring the global order, which is obviously not in the best possible shape, then more voices are needed. And certainly we need to ensure that many of those voices come from the global south. And within that dimension, we have to ensure that the voices of women are much better represented because they are much more attuned to conflict resolution and conflict prevention because they attach much greater value to the sanctity of life, well-being, and unimpeded human development. And those are areas that can actually act as safeguards for peace and development. Then the point has been made that whichever way the global institutions are reconstructed for further negotiations, there has to be a consistent application of principles with demonstrated and believable fairness, without which there will not be trust, and without trust, there will not be any peace that is likely to be lasting. The question of neoliberal policies has been clearly enunciated. It's very clear that the way tariffs have been imposed and withdrawn and altered, that we are seeing globalization, the slash and burn retreat of capitalism. And while globalization may be gasping, imperialism is not. And that we are seeing that the zombies of imperialism are very much around us, strutting around the global stage in very many forms. And we are seeing this in terms of aid programs. We are seeing this in terms of also free trade agreements, which are slanted in favor of the high-income countries. And coming from the world of public health, like Raman, I do, the pandemic treaty is a clear-cut example where the world was supposed to have united after COVID. Now there is no agreement on the pandemic treaty on two of the critical components, the pathogen and benefit sharing agreement. The United States not only walked out, but now it is subverting the agreement by having independent agreements with a number of countries which it is holding hostage to aid. We are seeing how it is signing a number of agreements in Africa, particularly illustrated by the agreements with Rwanda and Nigeria, where they are saying that unless you sign these agreements for pathogen sharing, we are not going to give you aid. We are not going to be part of your programs. So essentially, even in many other areas, we are seeing the manifestations of imperialism which are disadvantaging global solidarity. So it's not only missiles, but also trade agreements and aid programs. But while we are trying to really address the need for reconstructing a new world order, then clearly we'll have to look at how best it can actually embody the principles of social justice, gender justice, climate justice, and race justice, where we began Bandung with. But there's also the issue of intergenerational equity, which is seldom talked about. There's a world that has to be actually inherited by a different generation, and we are still grappling with the problems for our generation and leaving not much solace for the generation to come, but a heap of problems. So I think these are the issues that we need to discuss in any new movement for global solidarity. And I think that's where we have to go beyond Bandung. And I think whether it's beyond Bandung and back to Gandhi is, or back to Bandung and beyond, going to the future of Gandhi, we'll have to debate. But certainly, Bandung has to be resurrected in a new mold. And thank you very much for guiding the discussion on that. Thank you. Now I have the pleasure of inviting Sri Atul Kumar Tiwari ji, who is actually going to be soon assuming the office of the Director of the Council for Social Development,
Yes.
a distinguished civil servant who is now going to be the Director of CSD, to present the mementos to our distinguished speakers. Word of thanks by Soren, please.
Good evening, everybody. As we come to the close of this meaningful and thought-provoking Bandung Day Symposium 2026 on Bandung to BRICS, Women, War and Peace, it is my privilege to offer the vote of thanks on behalf of the organizers. First and foremost, I express my deepest gratitude to Professor K. Srinath Reddy, President CSD, for chairing this symposium and for his continued intellectual leadership and guidance. Our sincere thanks also to Sri K.N. Srivastava, Director IIC and CSD, for his warm welcome and for the support extended by IIC in co-hosting this event. We are deeply indebted to Professor Rama Baru and Professor Manoranjan Mohanty for setting the tone of today's symposium with their rich and stimulating introductions, grounding our deliberations in the spirit of Bandung and its continuing relevance in contemporary global politics. Our heartfelt appreciation goes to our distinguished speakers, Professor Anuradha Mitra Chinoy, Ambassador Meera Shankar, Professor Uma Chakravarti, Ms. Rita Manchanda, Ambassador Ruchira Kamboj, Professor Vasanti Raman, and Ambassador Shyam Saran, for sharing such profound insights on women, conflict, peace building, and the evolving significance of BRICS. Your interventions brought historical depth, policy perspective, and most importantly, ethical urgency to today's discussions. Special thanks are due to Dr. Ritvosha Mani Tiwari, our discussant, whose thoughtful reflections and probing observations enriched the conversation further and helped to weave together the many strands of today's discussions. We also gratefully acknowledge the Council for Social Development and IIC for jointly organizing this symposium and providing an important platform for critical engagement on questions of sovereignty, equality, peace, and human rights. I would also like to place on record our sincere appreciation to our knowledge partners for today's event, Bhagat Singh College and Shamlal College, Evening, University of Delhi, for their valuable collaboration and support. Their partnership has strengthened the academic and institutional foundations of this event, and we are grateful for their contribution to making this dialogue possible. I would like to thank Shri Atul Kumar Tiwari for guiding this event at its finalizing stage. I would also like to recognize the colleagues, staff members, and organizers of CSD and IIC working behind the scenes, those who coordinated the event, managed logistics, communications, and hospitality, and ensured the smooth conduct of today's program. Such events are made possible by many invisible hands, and we are deeply thankful to all of you. A word of appreciation as well to all participants, scholars, students, and members of the audience whose presence and engagement gave life to this event. Your questions and participation made this a genuine dialogue rather than a one-way exchange. As we reflect on the Bandung principles of 1955 and their resonance in our present moment, may the conversations initiated today continue beyond this hall, in our institutions, in policy spaces, and in collective struggles for peace and justice. Thank you all once again for being part of this important gathering. Safe evening. Thank you.
There is tea being served in the Pavella. Please join us there.